My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
A science story, huh?
These NYU scientists,
I felt
really
right.
I was so
And I just thought, well,
I had figured it out.
It was that golden moment.
Because science was on my side.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Story Collider, where we bring you true personal stories about science. I'm your host, Misha Gajewski, and this week, our stories are not for the easily squeamish or the faint of heart. They're honestly pretty gross, because science can be really, really disgusting sometimes. I forgot about this in a big way one year when I thought it would be a fun idea to go watch a live dissection of a sheep. The Royal Veterinary College in London was putting on this evening where it invited the public in to observe this dissection. And as someone who loves medical dramas and science and all that fun stuff, I was so into it. And it was over dinner time, so I went and got some takeout food and settled into the lecture hall ready to watch this vet dissect this sheep. And so the vet walks in and he puts this recently deceased sheep on the operating table at the front of the room. And I inch forward in my seat to get a better look. I can't wait. And he starts explaining everything that he's doing and why they do this. And I'm eating my French fries in rapt attention. And then he makes the first incision. And a few moments later, the smell hits me. This pungent odor of feces, decaying body matter, and whatever else is in the inside of a dead sheep wafts over me. And when I say I almost threw up my entire dinner, I'm not joking. See, when we think about science, we sometimes forget about the smells, sounds, and general messiness that comes with the pursuit of knowledge and truth. But both our storytellers are here today to give us the unfiltered, stomach-churning look into what really happens in science. Our first story is from Amy Segal. It was actually performed on our stages twice this year. First at Low Tide Motors in Brooklyn in April 2022, and then more recently at Caveat in New York in October this year. The themes those nights were pedal to the metal and reimagining, respectively.
I grew up in Phoenix at a time when girls took home ec and boys took shop and nobody protested. So while the boys were taking apart engines, I was preparing meals that were visually pleasing. And though I never took apart an engine, I took apart a cat in exchange for 150 extra credit points in Ms. Fangman's Anatomy and Physiology class at Arcadia High School. Now, just to be clear, this was not a cat dissection. This was a cat destruction because the assignment was to build a cat skeleton. And in order to do that, you needed a set of bones. And in order to get a set of bones, you needed to get a euthanized cat from the pound and boil it for hours until the skin and the muscles and the tendons and the ligaments and the organs melted away. Now, when Ms. Fangman, who had a shock of red hair and was obsessed with science, announced this project, she did so with an enthusiasm that was slightly unnerving because there was a disconnect between her zeal for the project and what we were going to have to go through in order to get it done. But 6 of us took her up on the challenge because we were juniors in high school, and because she was such a strict grader, the only way to get an A in her class was to do this extra credit project. And I was hell-bent on getting an A because I wanted to get the hell out of Phoenix. I mean, this was the mid-'80s, and Phoenix was a cultural wasteland. I mean, there was nothing going on. And my ticket out was a school on the East Coast that required good grades. Even so, I had misgivings because I like cats, and I had a cat at the time. And under no circumstances did I want to be responsible for the demise of one. And so I decided that rather than call the pound in advance and tell them what I needed, because I thought somehow this would incentivize them to euthanize a cat who wasn't otherwise scheduled, I was just gonna show up unannounced for however many days it took until one was available, even if this set us behind schedule. And when I say us, I mean me and Nancy, who was my partner in this project. It was done in teams. And so Nancy and I were on a team, and then the other two teams were all guys. And while there wasn't overt competition, there was this sort of underground current, because this was a time when there were still a lot of stereotypes around girls and science. And Nancy and I were hard chargers. I mean, I was running for president of the National Honor Society. She wanted to be a doctor. And so we set out to dispel this stereotype. And we only had 3 weeks to do it. Now, because she was on the track and field team and they had practice every day after school until after the pound closed, we decided that I would go by myself to pick up the cat. And so I'm driving over there thinking, okay, this is all in the name of science. It's all in the name of science. And I arrive and I tell them what I need, and they just hand me a dead cat, frozen in a garbage bag. And I'm startled by the heft of it because I somehow wasn't expecting it to be frozen. And I'm also startled by the fact that they didn't ask me any questions. I mean, I didn't have a note from the school. My parents weren't with me. I mean, I'm just this teenage girl asking for a dead cat. I mean, for all they knew, I was part of some animal ritual cult. But I loaded it into the trunk, and I stopped at the hardware store and bought an industrial-sized aluminum pot, like a 40-gallon pot. And I headed over to Nancy's house where we were setting up our lab in her backyard. And her parents were out of town, but we decided we needed to get started right away because we didn't know what we were going to do if it started to defrost. And so we filled the pot up with water, and we eased the cat in, and we lit the gas grill in the backyard, and we boiled it for hours. And the stench was just horrific. I mean, it was some combination of sulfur and rotten eggs, and you know that sewage smell you get sometimes when you're knocked back by a steaming manhole cover in New York. And even the dogs in the neighborhood agreed because they were howling. And we're poking and prodding it with this metal skewer to sort of help it along. And I said, do you think Steven Spielberg did this project? Because he went to our high school. And Raiders of the Lost Ark had just come out. And all I could think about was that scene where the tomb door opens and everybody's face starts to melt away. And I was like, I wonder if he got inspiration for that scene from this project. And finally we decided that it had sort of softened enough for us to start to extract the bones. But it was late and it was dark and it was, too hot for us to handle still. And so we were gonna wait until the next day to do that. But we couldn't leave it out on the grill overnight because coyotes and raccoons come out, and we figured they'd want to feast on this. And so we carried it into the shed and stored it there. And the next day after school, we put on Nancy's mother's rubber yellow dish gloves. And we started to poke and prod and pull and push to get the bones out of this morass. And the larger ones, like the femur and the ribs and the cranium, they easily sunk to the bottom. But the smaller ones, like from the feet, were still stuck in there. And when I say small, I mean tiny. The bones in a cat's foot are tiny. And we couldn't really get a good grip with these rubber gloves, so we removed them and just used our hands. We didn't have the internet back then, so we didn't have much to go on, but we knew that there should be about 240 bones in a cat skeleton as opposed to 206 in a human skeleton. And the reason we weren't sure exactly is because it depends on how long the tail is. But we laid them out on a paper towel, until we decided that we had a complete set. And so we were able then to throw out the rest of this detritus. But the problem was that some of the bones weren't clean, like the cartilage was still stuck to them. And so we asked Ms. Fangman the next day how we were going to get that off. And she just sort of smiled and said, you girls will figure it out. I mean, she gave us no guidance. And so we turned to the upperclassmen, the seniors, because Ms. Fangman had been assigning this for 15 plus years. And they said, muriatic acid. And we're like, oh yeah, where do we get that? And they said, a pool supply store. It's used to take grime off a pool tile. And so we went to the pool supply store and got some muriatic acid, and once again, no questions asked. And an hour later, we're in Nancy's backyard with a swing set in the distance handling acid. And it worked, and so then we started to assemble our skeleton, and we built a frame with a piece of plywood and these wooden dowels, and then we stacked books up to support it while we wired and glued it together. But the glue that we had wasn't working. It just wasn't adhering to the bones. And so we went to the hobby shop and got a second type of glue. And when we applied that, these tendrils of smoke started rising. And we're like, oh my God, this is gonna explode. And so we doused it with water, which is not what you're supposed to do when there's a chemical reaction. And so our bones were wet again, and so we had to lie them out again to dry out in the sun. But finally, we assembled our skeleton, and we loaded it into a box, and we took it to school, and we, put it next to the other two skeletons, and we were standing there like peacocks with our feathers on full display. We were so proud. And Ms. Fangman circles around the first one and circles around the second one, and then she circles around ours and pauses and says, the feet are on in the wrong position. You have them at an 85-degree angle instead of a 45-degree angle. This is carpal hyperextension. And we're like, what? And we were mortified because we were expecting these accolades to roll in, and instead we were embarrassed in front of the whole class, and especially in front of these, two teams of guys who were standing there sort of, snickering. And I'm thinking, am I gonna get enough extra credit points, to do well in this class? And we whisked that cat away back to Nancy's backyard, and we broke its feet, and we reset them along with our egos, and we took it back to the classroom where we left it there for the rest of the semester. And then when the semester was over, Nancy and I alternated between keeping the cat at our houses, and when it was at my house once, my cat jumped up onto the shelf, knocked it off, and it shattered everywhere. And that time we did not reset it. Now, I don't remember after all these years if I got an A in that class, but I do remember that I got the hell out of Phoenix.
That was Amy Segal. Amy Segal works in finance by day, but by night finds herself drawn to storytelling shows on the Lower East Side. She is a Moth Story Slam winner and is developing a one-person show. Okay, before we continue with today's episode, a couple of reminders. We have lots of live shows coming up this month. More specifically, on November 10th, we'll be hosting shows in Boise, Idaho, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. What can we say? It's a popular night. We're also going to be in the UK, in London, in New York City, and in Boston later this month. You can check out storyclatter.org/shows for tickets, and if you enter promo code ScienceStory at checkout, you'll get 10% off your tickets. That's SCINCE story, all one word, for a 10% discount, just for being a podcast listener, and obviously because we love seeing you at our shows. And if you'd like to learn more about how to tell a science story, check out storyclatter.org/education. We offer private workshops both online and in person for groups, and we offer public courses for individuals online as well. Also, for more updates and cool behind-the-story pictures and other awesome content, follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. Find us at Storyclatter. And finally, if you're a fan of this podcast, and if you, like us, believe in the power these stories have to reveal the humanity behind science, to change our understanding of how science happens and who it belongs to, please consider donating to The Story Collector at storycollector.org/donate. Also, if you're tired of listening to ads on this podcast, you can also sign up to our Patreon at patreon.com/thestorycollector. Our Patreon supporters receive an ad-free version of this podcast, as well as occasional bonus episodes and other gifts. We're so grateful to everyone who helps make our work possible.
What's the best way to learn a new language? Immersion. But sometimes that's not in the cards. But you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Now, I might only be 1 week into learning German with Babbel, but I'm so excited to start being able to speak German with my mom. With Babbel, you can learn everything you need to have real-world conversations, and all it takes is just 10 minutes a day. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college, which is bonkers. But Babbel is conversation-based learning with science-backed cognitive tools like spaced repetition and interactive lessons created by real language teachers and voiced by real native speakers. So here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/story. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/story. Spelled BABBEL.com/story. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This podcast brought to you by Ring. With Ring cameras, you can check on your pets to catch them in the act.
Izzy, drop that.
Or just keep them company.
Aw, I'll be home soon.
Make sure they're okay while you're away. With Ring. Learn more at ring.com/pets.
Our second story is from Dave Coyle. It was recorded in Atlanta at Waller's Coffee Shop in August 2022. The theme that night was the power of words.
So I grew up in southeast Minnesota, which is about the farthest cry you could think of from where we are today. Nothing but fields, woods, and cows pretty much surrounded us. And, you know, this was back in the early 80s where after breakfast and after chores, your mom just kicked you out of the house, basically, for the rest of the day. You could come back for lunch if you wanted. If you could find some food, you do that. But, you know, kids were pretty much on their own. So I spent my time riding around my red BMX bike just all over the place. There was a state forest nearby. There was a stream. I would just ride around and look at stuff outside. And I got really interested in insects and bugs. So I was just always looking at these things. It became like a hobby. And so, you know, I was in Fillmore County Fair. We took a cow to the fair. My pet cow, Carrie, won a trophy. I don't want to brag, but we did win a trophy. But I also took a bug collection to the fair, right? My mom and dad got me this little yellow insect guide, this little field guide that I still have to this day. It's super worn, but it was, you know, written at about a 7-8-year-old level. So I had this. I knew that thing backwards and forwards. Like, I knew my bugs. Stuff would fly by. I knew what that was, and I knew what that was. Fast forward a little bit. We moved when I was in going into 6th grade. We moved to the next town over. Now, I already had glasses. I already had braces. And if you want the fast track to not popular, come in as the new kid that also liked bugs, right? So I pushed all that down for a while, did the sports thing, but I was always interested in insects. You know, we'd be practicing, and if I'd see one, I'd be like, oh, there's a so-and-so, but it kept it inside, right? I ended up going to college at a small college in northeastern Iowa called Luther College, and I went there because it was close to home, and I could play football, so I did that. I was very much into athletics and all that, but I never really gave up. Like, the entomology was still deep down inside. The good news about college is it was freaking awesome, right? Like, I completely blossomed, probably not in a really conducive way to getting good grades. Like, I had a lot of fun, don't get me wrong, but I was not a good student, and I'll be the first one to tell you that. I went through a couple majors. You know, when I got there, I thought, I'll do elementary ed. That sounds like fun and kind of easy. And I remember that first course, we were making something with construction paper, and I thought, what the hell is this? This is ridiculous. So I'm not going to do that. And then I thought, well, I like numbers. Let me try a math major. And I took a calculus class. And after a week, they straight up stopped using numbers. And so it was just all these weird symbols, and that clearly didn't work out. When I was a sophomore, my advisor, I got a new advisor, and his name was Dr. Kirk Larson. Turns out he was an entomologist, right? So I thought, holy crap, you could do something with this. So the spark was reignited. I thought, yeah, man, I'm going to be an entomologist. Unfortunately, my grades said otherwise, right? So they were just not great. So back, a lot of students, college kids that are going into advanced, getting advanced degrees, they do undergraduate research project, right? So this is super common nowadays. Back then, and this is pushing 30 years ago, you did an undergraduate research project if you were A, a super overachiever, or B, you straight up needed help to get into grad school. Okay, I was B by a long shot, right? So Doc Larson and I got this idea, we can do an undergraduate project. We are going to look for this endangered beetle, the American burying beetle. Okay, and so this is a type of beetle that basically is nature's recycler. It's a great big thing, inch and a half long. These bugs go and they find dead stuff. They dig underneath it. It drops in. They bury it. They lay their eggs on it. Problem solved, right? It's not a stretch to say if we didn't have this group of insects that there'd be carcasses everywhere, okay? So we were going to search for this beetle that was supposed to be, extinct or at least not seen in Northeast Iowa for, almost 100 years. So we set out to do this project. I was going to look at these 4 different spots. And so we thought about, well, how are you going to find this thing? And remember, these beetles eat dead stuff, right? So the key is going to be if you're having a bait, it's got to smell. I've grown up on the farm, so I had some connections. So we thought, well, we'll do dead pigs. I can get those from home. So I go home, I bring these dead piglets back, and then I went to the local fish hatchery and we got dead fish from them. I knew those guys there, and so, I could do that. And then we wanted to do 2 more, right? Because this was science. We had to have some tests. So we thought about chicken and beef. Where I went to college is a small town. Like, there's basically one grocery store. So it was super awkward as, 21-year-old Dave walking in. They knew who I was. Like, hey, can I have your rotten beef livers and some old chicken wings? That's what I need. And they were gracious. They gave them to me. So the problem is if you just have these things, they're not really that smelly by themselves, right? So you got to really get them ripe. So what we did was we got these Tupperware containers, these big tubs, and we put the stuff in there, and then we set it on top of this thing outside the biology department, right? This is this big container thing. And you let them cook for about a week, right? And if you've not been to the Midwest, some people think, oh, that's north. It must not be hot. It's hot as blazes, but just for a couple months out of the year, right? And that's when we did this. So I had all this dead stuff in these tubs sitting on these outside, they're big, fan type things, just cooking. And, it's interesting. If you're at home and you're making a soup at home and you get the consistency just right where it kind of sloshes, you're like, awesome, this is going to be the best, right? But if you're actually cooking dead things and it reaches that sloshy consistency, it's just horrible, absolutely horrible. And so, I mentioned I grew up on a farm. I've seen some things and I've smelled some things in my day. Without a shadow of a doubt, the first time I took the lid off that first container, it was the worst thing I'd smelled, hands down. It stopped my breath. It burned my eyes. There were just sort of tears and snot coming out. It was the worst thing in the world. And even worse yet is now I have to load it up in my little Ford Festiva, which is a glorified roller skate. And we got to go on off to all these study sites, right? So the way you catch these beetles, you dig a hole in the ground and you put a 5-gallon pail in, and then you put your bait into this glass jar, and it just sits down in the middle, and then the beetles smell it, they walk around the ground, and they fall in there, and you catch them that way. So I spent 10 weeks doing this. Every bump I hit with my car, I just winced because I knew what was going on in the back hatch. Every time you carried it out, you carry it so carefully, just please don't miss a step. If your clothes got stuff on it, I just chucked them. Most of my outfits that summer were just flat out disposable because the smell is just not coming off. So we did this whole project, went through thousands of beetles at the end of the summer, and holy crap, I freaking got one, right? So entomological fame is going to be mine. I'm going to punch my ticket to glory. And so, flying high, right? And so we take this, I put a poster together as we do at this stage, and I went to this national entomology meetings in Louisville, Kentucky. And there's this sort of thing we do where there's called a poster session where all the people with their posters stand by it, and you stand there, and then people will walk up and they will talk to you about it. So I'm standing there, I got my new tie and all that type of thing, feathers all puffed out because I found this friggin' beetle, right? And so we were there not too long, and this fuzzy little fella comes up. I say fuzzy because basically from the neck to the top of his head was the same length of gray hair, just all over. And he takes a look and he's like, oh, that's not it. And in my head, I'm thinking, what is this, the world's expert on burying beetles or something? And then when he introduced himself, he was actually the world's expert on burying beetles. So he knew that it was not that. I saw an hour and a half. I had to stand by the stupid poster at that point. Prior to that, I had thought if I don't do science for a career, I was just going to work with my best friend at his roofing company, right? We were going to just roof for the summer, make a couple grand, go to Europe, blow it. It's going to be awesome. That being said, I did not want to become a roofer because I had basically done manual labor my whole life, farming, construction. I knew I could be a roofer, but God, that sounds freaking horrible, right? But at that point, when he told me that's not the beetle, in my head, it was like, shit, I'm going to be a roofer now. So I stood there, and my mentor at the time, Doc Larson, came over, and he gave me a little bit of a pep talk. It didn't work at all. Like, he was talking, had his hand on my shoulder, trying to console me, and in my head, I was just thinking, like, I'm going to be a roofer, and this is like, my life blows at this point. And so a little more time passes. At the end of that poster session, right, I'm just like completely mentally zapped. This other fellow walks up, and turns out he's a professor at Iowa State. And we start talking about stuff, and we start talking about grad school, and I was like, I mean, I would love to, but I don't really have the grades for it. He said, that's okay, we'll bring you in on probation. I was like, oh, so there's a chance now, right? So I went to Iowa State, and I got my master's, and, you know, I always think back, because now I'm an assistant professor, right? I actually did what I thought I would do, and I think back to when I was 7. We had to do this thing in school where you had this little journal, right? And you had to write, what do you want to be when you grow up? Most kids put farmer, fireman, policeman, all the standard stuff. But I actually wrote, I want to be an entomologist. Spelled it right and everything. My mom still has that to this day. And I think the second call I made after I got offered that job at Clemson was to Mom. And I was like, Mom, you're never going to guess what I did, but I did it. Thank you.
That was Dave Coyle. Dave is an assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. His extension forestry program focuses on forest and tree health and invasive species management in natural and managed landscapes across the Southeast. Dave's research program focuses on the biology and management of invasive plants and insects. The Story Collector is so grateful to Amy and Dave for sharing their stories with us. The Story Collector is also very grateful for the support of Science Sandbox, a Simons Foundation initiative dedicated to engaging everyone with the process of science. This podcast is produced by Erin Barker, executive director and co-founder of The Story Collector, along with me, managing producer Misha Gajewski, and senior podcast editor John Chen, and with help from education director Lily B. Special thanks goes out to Story Collector's board and the rest of our staff, including Managing Director Anne-Marie Lonsdale, Science Advisory Fellow Edith Gonzalez, and Operations Manager Lindsay Cooper, without whom none of this would be possible. The stories featured in today's episode were from shows produced by Paula Croxon and Tracy Segara, and Mesa Salida and Kelly Vinyl, respectively. Our theme music is by Ghost, and next week we'll be back with stories about pain. We hope the wait isn't too painful for you, though. Until then, thanks for listening.